Hi, my name's Harpinder Singh Powar. I'm the channel CTO for EMEA at Rubrik. Been here for about 2 years. Prior to that, was working at Dell Technologies for about 5 years. Rich?
Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Richard Cassidy. I'm Field CISO for EMEA at Rubrik. Year 26 in industry, mainly in cyber defense, threat hunting, and working a lot with CISOs on what they're doing and not doing. So looking forward to a good discussion today.
Just a little bit of experience then, I guess.
Just a tiny bit.
I suppose the thing is that I've kind of noticed, obviously you've been at Rubrik for 18 months. I've been here for about 6 months longer. And we've done a lot of work together, events and just in general, customer meetings, partner meetings. And that's kind of bringing together the infrastructure side and the security side, because typically that used to be quite separate. And I think that the key for today's discussion that we're going to have is around aligning security and infrastructure together to speed up responses and remediate. So I think the first thing I'm starting to hear a lot, and I know for a fact you've been hearing a lot as well from your conversations with CIOs and CISOs, is around not only integrating these two teams, but minimal viable business. So probably for the audience, what is minimal viable business and how do we get there?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's going to become the new litmus test by which businesses now need to operate from not just an operational perspective, but also cybersecurity. So, whether you're a C-level leader, whether you're a practitioner at the coalface, I think historically what businesses have done is approach security almost as a piecemeal approach. They followed the hype cycles that Gartner, Forrester, whoever it may be, have listed, and they've gone and applied those technologies, and typically deployed 100% of the tech and ever only used 20% of the functionality. And so the regulators have sort of become very concerned about the number of attacks we're seeing, successful attacks, and not just the regulators, but the general market as well. And so they said, well, something's got to change. We can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results, right? The definition of madness. And so the way that the industry is now gearing itself up is say, let's understand what a minimum viable business looks like and what our important business services are. And then let's make sure they can always be operational or be re-operationalized in the shortest period of time should something happen. And something is a broad remit as well. It can be a failure of systems. It can be a failure of a third-party service provider, which is happening more and more these days, unfortunately. Or it can be a traditional breach or ransomware attack. So if you understand your minimum viable business and you build your security and operational ecosystems around that, now you've got a much more scalable, a much more plausible way of ensuring to the board and the stakeholders and your customers that you can remain operational and you can deliver services.
Yeah, I think it's a good point because as you mentioned, obviously a cyber attack happens, it's more likely to happen than a fire or a theft of data. I learned that from one of your podcasts, which I listened to this week. But sometimes we're always talking about cyber, obviously from our perspective as well, we're always talking about cyber attacks, but it's not always about cyber attacks. It could just be fat fingers or something else that, and when we're talking about a minimal viable business, we're not necessarily always talking about recovering everything. I used to work for a bank many moons ago, and we used to do an annual DR test, and it used to be a week. And we used to like going there because, we get lunch paid for. That was the main thing. Yeah. So we'd go there, so the DBAs would be there, the infrastructure guys, the network security teams. And we'd be at a data center for a week, and it starts at Monday, 9 o'clock. And that's where we pick up the phone, ring up Iron Mountain to bring our tapes. And we have to wait, 2-3 hours for those tapes to come, and that's when we start building an environment for us to start recovering into. Now, over the years, that became more and more difficult because obviously with tapes, we're getting more read-write errors, and then we're having to recall the previous day's tapes and recovering those. And essentially, we passed all the tests, but it was not the cleanest of things. But Friday around about 4 o'clock, we'd kind of recover everything. But essentially, we're always recovering everything. And it's a cyber attack or any kind of disruption to a business is not always going to be recover everything. It might just be a subset. You might get something gone wrong with a particular application or some software, but it's about testing those recoveries, because an annual DR test is not going to be enough. Obviously, that's where Predatar come in as well, because they can help with the automation of testing these recoveries, especially for critical systems, bringing them up into clean areas, and then running your EDR type things on there. Is it clean? Is it actually clean? So I think from my perspective, it's doing backups is one thing. Where obviously we know it's all about recoveries. It's making sure we're testing those recoveries regularly, because only that way you can actually test your minimal viable business. Because otherwise it's just written on paper or on a Word document, which doesn't really translate to anything unless you actually test it and prove it. Is that what you're saying? Is that what people are doing now, or do you think it's still a bit of a problem?
Yeah, I mean, look, you've defined the perfect case of how businesses have thought of true disaster recovery. Is can I get my business up and running from a monolithic backup scenario? And often the answer is yes. I mean, even if you go back to tape drives, that's the answer. But I think where we're at today with cyber resilience is a lot of companies, it's similar to the children's story of the emperor's new clothes, right? In that we think we have the suit on that's going to protect us, but actually reality, we don't. We're very well exposed. And it's great that regulators have started to sort of show the business that you are the emperor in the new clothes and you haven't quite got the protection that you need, and that you don't need to turn everything back on in an operational outage. It's just those critical things that get you to the point where you can service the customers you're servicing. Now, there's a heavy focus on critical national infrastructure for obvious reasons, and for those that are watching here and listening, don't think about C&I as sort of nuclear and utilities companies. Critical national infrastructure is now healthcare, it's now finance, right? It's transport, because we don't want the economy to be down. And then when you have to answer that question, you've got to say, well, my goodness, how do I turn on an entire bank? Well, you don't do that in days. Even in the worst case scenario, that's going to be still months. But what are the elements of those businesses that they operate that can be and should be recovered within 2-4 hours, and make sure you know what they are and you know how to get business operations running. So I'm still seeing a lot of organizations and a lot of CISOs I talk to make the cardinal error of thinking that the cloud service providers that they're kind of migrating to around SaaS applications and stuff have their back when something goes wrong. And yes, they do. They'll give you a new instance with all of the services that you need, but your data is your responsibility, and the data that needs to be rehydrated to get the application, the service running again, isn't going to be there in the way that you think it is. And you're going to have to start chasing your tail and recovering files. So you've got to start to look at this as important business services or minimum viable business, depends on whether you're looking at PRA or whether you're looking at DORA, right? Because the regulations name it differently. And know that and go on that journey. And that's not easy to do. If you haven't looked at what an important business service is, you should be looking at it. And you should be looking at the building blocks that get you there, because a business service does also mean potentially hundreds of sort of dependencies that you've got to build a whole recovery plan around. Go on that journey, figure out what that is, and then build your operational resilience plans around that. That's what regulation wants. That's what the market wants. That's what you need to do as a business.
And that's what we should be doing anyway, isn't it? And these regulations are there for a reason. For example, you've touched on DORA being around financial institutions, but it's like they're only just telling you stuff you should be doing anyway. You're making sure that your data is secure and your customers' data is secure, because there's two elements to this. One is your minimal viable business. The other one is your customers. 100%. What do you need? What does your customers need? It's not necessarily always around your business, but what do your customers need as well? And that's something that we're
and I'd love to add on to that, because I think too many businesses, especially, I've investigated a lot of breaches in my time as well, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the very, very ugly. And a lot of organizations still look at it as kind of my house. And so it's an intrinsic built sort of cybersecurity, operational resilience ecosystem. I think where we talk about understanding your customer's pain, we're talking, companies that hold sensitive data, healthcare, finance, for example. Look at what would happen to the customer. What does the customer need you to do to best protect their data and to be able to service them as quickly as you possibly can, post a breach or an operational failure, and make sure you're stress testing your operation resilience plans on that side of it. So take the extrinsic view, not just the intrinsic one. And I think we'll be in a better place if we're doing that. So it's a very underserved part of operational resilience mindset.
I think especially what we're seeing a lot in the industry now is it's about speed of remediation, isn't it? It's not necessarily you can't bring your data back up, but it's how long is it going to take for you to bring your applications services back up. So the longer that is, the more likely a company is going to be to pay the ransom.
Indeed.
So I know obviously the median dwell time is now dramatically reduced. I think it's 9 days internationally for attackers to break in, move laterally, and either encrypt data or get into a position of comfort. I think it's 5 days in North America, so it's even worse over there. So it means that those, what we kind of call the traditional attacks, like the Northern Ireland police attack, where the malware was there for like 14 months before it went detonated and released the names and addresses of all the police officers in North America, which is obviously really bad. That's almost like an old school attack now, because I think when I joined Rubrik a couple of years ago, that was the kind of attack I was talking about at the start. Do you know, Mr. Customer, if there's any malware or ransomware in your environment at the moment? And typically the answer is always no, because I'm not looking for it. So we're like, oh yeah, malware could be sitting there for many, many months before it goes initiates. But now we're not talking months anymore. We're talking about days, aren't we? And we're talking about being able to respond really quickly. So from our own Rubrik Zero Labs research, we know that 93% of the attacks that have happened have targeted backups, and 73%, so 3 out of 4, have been successful. So, 3 out of 4 backup platforms, 3 out of 4 customers, they've got backups in place, but unless you're testing them, how robust is that? So I think from my perspective is the fact that we have to be a lot faster, and that's where obviously we do a lot of work ourselves as CTO and CISO, trying to bridge that gap. And we have to start integrating with security tools. We have to start bridging that gap between infrastructure and security, because you don't want 2 different teams running in different directions. Infrastructure team saying, hey, we think this is the blast radius and this is what's happened. SecOps teams running off in a different direction, because again, that time to remediation just continually increases, isn't it? Yeah.
And I want to make an important distinction between what we're up against here, okay? So I say this jovially, but it is unfortunately, what's said in jest is often said in truth, that there are 2 types of companies, and you would have heard this in probably some of my other interviews: those that have been already hacked by a nation state, and those that don't yet know they've been hacked by a nation state. And I was with a large consultancy last week with their threat response team and their threat analytics team, and they had a finance customer, that had a nation state in the environment with persistence of 7 years. Now, when I was doing threat hunting and investigation analysis, I was finding nation states in organizations for up to 3+ years. Now, I'm telling you, there's no doubt that hasn't changed, right? Nation states are very, very enabled now, and I wouldn't be surprised if businesses already had them in for years as it stands. Now, the cyber criminals, which are the smash and grab sort of element of the cyber adversarial underworld, they're the ones that tend to want to go in, focus heavily on getting data, going after the backups, things like this. And so you need a cybersecurity capability that has the ability to look for both, right? You want to be able to detect the smash and grab, which is fantastic with all the latest tool sets, but you also need to look at persistence. And so then how do you find persistence, right? If the current tool sets aren't working, what are we not doing? And this is actually one of the reasons I joined Rubrik, because 26 years in, I was like, well, I've sold everything from EDR to AV to network-based security detection tools to UTM, the whole gambit. And one of the things that I found in a lot of the threats I investigated was the signs and symptoms of the persistence were already there, and a lot of it sat in the backup data. And this is where I love, to see where companies like Rubrik are at. They're saying, let's use the backup data. It's a treasure trove of data. And the good thing about backup data is it's black and white. It either is or isn't there. And you're not asking log files or abstract information about what you think. You're going to the raw information. And so businesses need to be, and you talked about earlier on, IT ops and SecOps being siloed. That's broken. IT ops are the superheroes now of the cybersecurity ecosystem. They have data that cybersecurity should be leveraging a lot more, that security teams should be leveraging a lot more to find those really nasty, persistent nation-state attackers, and get better at filling the context and finding out what the problems are. So I think that's what the industry needs to think about better, is bringing IT ops, SecOps together for good reason, to get context faster, to find the nightmares waiting to become a reality sooner.
And we're starting to see the bad actors actually working together as well, aren't we? With the MGM grand attack with Black Cat and Scattered Spider, two different areas of the globe, working together to be able to go and attack a customer, which is pretty scary again, because obviously from our perspective, we're looking at protection, but if the bad actors, cyber criminals, are starting to work together, utilizing capabilities that each other have, for example, the Russians don't have is that language, but from the Scattered Spider side of things, based in the US, UK, and Canada, they have that. But then they can get the door entry, and then they can pass that over to, Black Cat, who can then do what they do best from a malware perspective. So, it's a bit of a crazy world.
It is indeed. You raised some good points there about the attacker adversarial groups becoming much more enabled. I mean, so here's some facts which are quite harrowing. The cybercrime economy by 2025 will be $10.5 trillion. So that would make it the world's third largest economy. And so if you think about you as an organization, and for those that are listening in on this, how big is your security budget? How big is your ops resilience budget? It certainly isn't trillions. You'd be lucky if it's tens of millions. And so you're up against a really hard task. And a lot of these groups and some of the work that I do in monitoring kind of what's going on, there's active recruitment at the moment, and so the Chilling Group, which are famous for a lot of things in terms of ransomware, are an amalgamation of scores and scores of malware writers and groups. And so that level of innovation and capability, very few businesses would ever reach, and even some governments would struggle to match. So you've got to think about, you can't outsmart in the traditional sense, but you can get smarter at how you detect what they're doing. And that's where I come back to, please connect data in motion and data arrest inspection to find that persistence, to find the bad news before it becomes, unfortunately, headline news.
Yeah. We were laughing about this last week. We're talking about, phishing, smishing, phishing. Oh, yeah. We're seeing that all the time. Pretty much phishing, obviously, from an email perspective. Smishing, so SMS-based, which we're getting every day pretty much. Vishing, which is obviously the voice.
That's right.
Mimicking people's voices. And if you think about smaller organizations especially, mimicking someone's voice when you know that person's voice, for example, the help desk, it's quite easily done, but it's quite easy, you will fall into those traps. And I think it's not only necessarily when we're talking about the large corporate organizations, but let's say, for example, you go to Pure Gym, stealing your credentials at Pure Gym, the chances of you using the same password in your corporate environment can be quite high. So we're seeing a lot of that.
I'm not going to make any admissions, but yeah, a lot of us fall into that bucket.
So we have that as well, It's, so that they are targeting different areas. And one area was mobile malware. Mm-hmm. You scared me quite a bit a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, when you were talking about Roblox and how they're targeting children with the games. I'll be honest, since that day, I've deleted Roblox off my other phone. I'm looking at, what the children are doing, because there's obviously, like we talk about security fatigue, the same kind of thing when we're talking about purchases on your phones as well, where now it's everything's Face ID because we can't be bothered to put a password in. Mm-hmm. And then I'm always getting my kids come up to me when I'm at a party or something, just sticking my own phone in front of my face and, Face ID, Daddy, you want to purchase this or whatever it is. But yeah, do you want to just mention about the Roblox thing? Because
look,
you got an opportunity to scare more people now.
Yeah, and the point of the conversation is not to make people think, oh my God, put their head in their hands and cry, that everything's going to it's all coming to an end. You know, attackers will always target the weakest link in the chain. And, you know, corporations used to say it was the users, which was you and I. And, you know, but they're getting better at training. There's more awareness in the industry now about the sort of attacks that are going on. But your kids aren't trained. They're not aware. And how many times is it like the story I shared with you? You're on that long journey, and you've got your kids or your nephews and nieces if you haven't got kids, and you've got your sisters or brothers' children. That their iPad batteries failed, and you're like they're screaming at you for sort of entertainment, and you just throw your phone over the back, and away they go. Who knows what they're installing? So there are increasing targets on these gamings from a mobile perspective, which adds a new risk factor we hadn't even thought about. But that brings it back to the point that let's just assume that this is going to go wrong. Let's assume we're going to get breached from one of the angles, whether it's the home network or the corporate network or the cloud environment. And with that mindset, in view, how do we then go about building a capability to recover from the worst case scenario? And I think that's what we take away. Think about it in that term, and you'll really have a capability that will match what the adversaries are able to do in today's space.
And it's not necessarily, if you think about from a phone perspective, what's on a phone, if you've got your emails, if you've got application from work on there, they've got access to that. Anything sensitive from a photo perspective that doesn't want to be leaked. They're not necessarily coming after you to pay a ransom, but they just want you to log into Rubrik or log into whatever it is just to get in. So pretty scary world. So the last thing I want to talk about really here was the big concern really, which is exfiltration of data. Now, attackers are getting quite impatient, where you mentioned smash and grab, where they're not necessarily just coming and smash and grab with encryption or encrypting files or encrypting VMs, which we're seeing over 60% of the attacks are doing. They're just waltzing in, taking data and then getting back out. And organizations have no idea that, firstly, they were in. Secondly, that they've stolen the data. And it's only when they get a message from the cyber attacker say, we've got some of your data. Now, there's only one fix for that really, isn't it? And that's better cyber posture. Being able to play on the front foot and not on the back foot, and being able to look at the door and who's coming through the door. Are they the right people? Have they got the right access? But also from a data perspective, where is that data? Because in this hybrid world we're living in, where you've got a lot of SaaS applications, a lot of data in the cloud, as well as your on-premise. I mean, people don't know where the sensitive data is on-premise, let alone these cloud platforms. So the need for better security posture is going to be huge, isn't it, going forwards, because the amount of sensitive data we have is just constantly growing. We talk about data growing by 5 to 7x in the next 5 years. That's going to be a huge problem, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good point to close on, in that it's still very underserved in the industry. The asset management, not just of actual IT assets and assets that help you run your business, but data, is still very hard to solve. And there are a number of vendors out there that are doing it well. But to your point, you've got to think about your data end to end, your on-prem and your cloud. You've got to have the ability to be able to understand where your sensitive data sits and continuously question that, right? Because, typical asset management life cycles have been done daily, weekly, in fact, some even less than that, every 6 or months or quarter. Ask every time new data silos spin up, what is it? What data sits there? Is it sensitive? Is it not? And make sure that you bring in the sensitive data back into your protection and control mechanisms, and that you're finding out where it sits. Don't just assume that your developers are going to behave themselves and follow the corporate playbook. And so it's a really good point. Data security posture management is super important in the cloud SaaS environments. But that whole data awareness, sensitive data awareness across on-prem and cloud is super important, because at the end of the day, you're right, they're coming in for the data, and they've even just get a megabyte of data. That's still enough for them to hold you to a ransom payment, not traditional ransomware, but actually a ransom payment to say, I've got your data, I'm going to release it if you don't pay me. And a lot of organizations, unfortunately, don't make the decision that we would want them to, which is not to pay, because what do you do about it? And so it's a tricky one, but it's solved by knowing where your data is and putting the controls around them in the best way possible.
So we started the conversation off with kind of like my key takeaway, which is around CTO and CISO infrastructure security, bringing the two together. So I'll let you close off with what you think is your takeaway that you want to tell anyone that's listening.
Well, it's been a great discussion so far. We've covered an awful lot of ground. And I think the key takeaways from this conversation are that the adversarial space is more enabled now than it's ever been. And we have to change what we've been doing, because what we have been doing, clearly based upon the news reports over the past years and months and weeks, hasn't worked. What we need to get better at is looking at data at rest and data in motion from a cybersecurity and operational resilience perspective. And let's make sure we know what our minimum viable business is. Stress test that, ask the questions, and make sure you have the right controls and you're validating those controls on how you can get back to operational effectiveness in the shortest possible time frame. So it's been a great discussion. Thank you so much. I'll hand you back over to the guys.